Hello, everyone. Welcome to a very pivotal episode of the War Report. And what we've spent like 20 minutes, half an hour, just talking about this stuff off air so far. That could have been like half the show itself or a quarter of the show itself. I have no idea how long this episode's going to be, but a lot of this information, just for clarity's sake, will probably be outdated by the time you guys see this tomorrow evening. Because we're recording on Tuesday night right now. It is 8:14 p.m. in the Eastern Time Zone for both of us. But Israel and Palestine have come to really trade blows. We touched on this briefly last episode, but it's gotten much further out of hand than I would have expected. And we kind of want to do something different, a little different. We're going to get into the political takes, what actually happened with the situation. And then I want to get more into the esoteric side, as you'll be able to deduce from this episode's title, into the theology, the eschatology of all of this. And again, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. But just a little preview of what we're going to be getting into. We're going to do something we've kind of wanted to do for a while, and I figured this is no better excuse to do it. But just starting, of course, we discussed on Saturday the Al Aqsa Mosque was attacked by the IDF forces, which led to brief Palestinian retaliations. You saw those retaliations escalate over these past couple days to the point where, at this point, as we're talking about this, they have completely overwhelmed the Iron Dome. The interceptor missiles are hitting the interceptor missiles. That's how much they've overwhelmed it. With rocket attacks coming out of Gaza, riots in the West Bank, I think even Hezbollah has Hezbollah actually taken that extra step and attacked northern Israel yet, or are they just threatening to at this point? I think they're just threatening to at this point.
They haven't. They made a statement sometime yesterday that if Gaza is attacked, and if the Palestinians want that, they will come to their aid. Nothing was said, and then I saw another headline because honestly, there's been a real flurry of headlines all day, and I'm at work and I really can't see all of them.
Well, simply slack off during
Um,
work. That's what I do.
yeah. Uh, um, However, I did see one headline that said that Hezbollah has joined the fight. Where, when, I don't know. And, I don't think Hezbollah wants anyone to know either.
And I
Given the
think
way
just
these attacks
strategically,
have unfolded.
yeah, just strategically speaking, most of Hezbollah's forces are still focused on the war in Syria. So, in terms of a offensive on northern Israel, their capacity is probably just limited materially right now.
Bashar Assad laughing meme.
Indeed, that'll be interesting to see if what Syria does in the wake of all this. We got some news about Syria. We'll get into a minute with along with Saudi Arabia and Iran, but we just want to get this big news out of the stuff before we get into the topic that's going to take us like half hour, 45 minutes to discuss with the broader takes on this. So, of course, as we said, this was probably the biggest one. You had Israeli security officials saying this is just as big, if not bigger, than the Second Intifada. And at this point, it's in a lot of these mixed towns, they're smaller towns, but these mixed Jewish Arab towns, you're seeing just these government facilities, these police precincts be overrun, and the authority of these local governments being completely overturned by these rioters, by these Arabs looking to take control. And it really it's really reminiscent of 2014, 2013, 2014 Eastern Ukraine, like the Donbass and Luhansk, when you had these pro-Russian groups overrun the local authorities and take over these police stations and establish their own law and order. That's what it seems like right now to me, especially in Lodz, the big town where this is happening, where the Arabs have taken control of about three police precincts, and the mayor has declared a state of emergency. Rockets, it's raining rockets on Israel right now. Like, most of what you hear about the Zionists when they kvetch about Israel being under attack when Gaza sends off some bottle rockets, like, that is what they're talking about right now. This is what they want you to think it is, because it actually is this way. And really, this just looks like Israel is on the ropes, and as you speculate, and as I tend to agree, This is about a week out after Netanyahu failed to form a governing coalition, which would have forced an election. So,
Yep.
again, and I think it's reasonable speculation that this is a both figurative and literal controlled burn that got out of control. It's a crisis they started to manufacture so Netanyahu could come in, restore order, and look strong and win the favor of the electorate. But it looks like that's gotten a little out of control. And really, all of these moves, these really crackdowns, the initial incident again with the Al Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock and everything, that reeked of Israeli desperation right then and there, especially again with their northern flank being surrounded by Syria, Hezbollah, other pro-Iranian groups. They don't really have to worry about their southern flank. The Jordanians or the Egyptians, they're not going to do much. They've pretty much capitulated. But it just
Well, it's
looks.
ironic.
It
It's
is.
ironic that they wanted to have the Chariots of Fire exercise commence yesterday, which was supposed to be an exercise that would simulate repelling an invasion, virtually from all sides, but focus on the north and the south of Israel. And instead, it's happened from within, quite central. Um, I'll just read a list of the towns affected in big ways. So these aren't just strikes, but where some amount or a great amount of control has been lost in these towns. Tamra, Haifa, Nazareth, Lod. Lod is a small city just south of Tel Aviv. I guess it's a suburb in some ways. Three police precincts have been taken over by Palestinians. Jadeh Makar, Majad al Kurum, Rahat, Darubia, al Fam, uh, Shakib al Salam, Derhana, Jaljulia, Shefa Amir, Kafr Kana, Nahef, Araba Batuf, Kafr Manda, Araba, Ramla, Jaffa, and Beersheba. That's a quite a few towns, and I do think he gambled. Netanyahu did to save his career. He's done this gamble before, and he's not the only Israeli leader that has made this gamble, and it's paid off with short-term costs, but long-term gains. This creates the justification to uproot Palestinians, demolish their homes, get over more land. And despite the similarities with Ukraine right now in 2014, the truth is nobody is going to come to the Palestinians' defense. They can't. There isn't any player that could do that,
Yeah, all the
and
players that are
the,
willing
the
to are
world will not.
unable, and all the parties that are able are unwilling to. It's like, I mean, I'm sure Iran would love to deliver the crushing blow to Israel right now, but it's just not within their. It's not within their means. It's just something they cannot do. Whereas Russia or China might be able to would theoretically be able to egg this on, but they're not willing to put the extra step forward to be the country that quote unquote destroyed Israel. So again, it's a tough place for the Palestinians because, like I said, your two options are either the unwilling or the unable.
Right, and let's not forget that um, Putin agreed uh, to enter on behalf of Assad after Assad requested for Russia's assistance in the fight against ISIS, Al Qaeda, and all the other Al Qaeda and ISIS affiliated groups, with the caveat that Putin would have some kind of a peace deal between Syria and Israel. Um, so that's always been there from the beginning. Um, of course, I don't think Russia or Syria are particularly pleased with the routine bombings that Israel conducts for at least 5 years now, about 5 years. Very steady, and the last 3 years, bombing the outskirts of Damascus on Christmas and Christmas Eve. I mean, it's a form of terror. because um, yes,
On
you
both
will argue
calendars,
that
mind
they
you, on both the Julian and the Gregorian. So they're really working overtime. We gotta respect our
yeah,
friends in Israel.
yeah. So are they going to hit the center? Are they going to stick to the outskirts? How's Christmas with the sound of bombs landing, 10 miles from your church, lighting up the night sky? It's there to terrify them, to demoralize them. So, um, Israel is in a bind right now. I think that I think the important thing to stress is how much Hamas has figured out Netanyahu's psychology. It's very interesting how, in the last 24 hours, how this conflict has evolved. So, you have, I mean, the original dispute is about houses in Jerusalem, in the Arab sector, that are going to be taken away. They're going to be sold to Israeli Jews. The Palestinians who owe them will lose them. And, this goes back to a very age-old argument. Those houses um, were sold to them, I believe, before 1948. But then after the creation of Israel, Israel on peace conditions agreed that the Palestinians could have those houses. Um, then in 1972, that was ratified, it was reaffirmed. But of course, the Arab countries around Israel have steadily become weaker and weaker. Israel has become stronger. America has, rose to create a unipolar world where, therefore, Israel could not really be challenged anymore. And Iraq War One and Iraq War Two definitely made that abundantly clear. Um, so yes, those houses, Palestinians did sell those houses to Jews prior to 1948. Those houses were then taken by Palestinians. The Israelis in the peace terms agreed that they could keep those houses. I mean, you know, this land distribution was, I mean, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, both Christian and Muslim, were just, escorted out of the country, as it were. So this kind of land distribution was happening from 1948 onwards. You know, it's well documented, and we're not going to get into that. So that's the long history of this. However, Netanyahu, basically his bargain was, if I go up to the Temple Mount and I disturb the Al-Aqsa Mosque, I will have cheering fans, which he got. Um, so you see the videos of the IDF soldiers, the police, barging into the mosque during Ramadan, stun grenades, people being beaten and arrested and dragged out, and so on. And of course, this infuriated them. But not the last time there was a resistance, there, was the Second Intifada, and that was many, many years ago. And well, compared to 2021. And I think no one expected the retaliation to be so strong. And just to get back to my point about the way the retaliation has evolved, was that the rockets that were launched in the daytime yesterday, though there were many, and the evidence showed that these were not baguettes, because up until this point, the Palestinians launched these small rockets. People even joked and called them just bottle rockets. Not very effective. More
Us
of a
included.
terror. More. Hmm?
Us included,
Sorry.
calling them bottle rockets.
Yeah, yeah, us included. So, but however, so the rockets that were launched yesterday, these are quite large. I mean, they're on the magnitude that you see in Yemen, and there's other reasons why we can compare these rockets to Yemen. So Hamas said basically, if you attack Gaza, you're going to pay for it, right? Now, I mean, this kind of rhetoric has happened before. Uh, not too long ago, a little over 10 years ago, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Palestinians were killed with similar kind of rhetoric. And, Gaza was completely obliterated. Now, what's different is this time they came through and they completely overwhelmed the Iron Drone. And think back to that errant missile that was launched by, I believe it was an S-100, so very old tech, no more than an S-200. This is just barely above a Buk. And so the missile missed the Israeli jet that was bombing Syria, but it flew past the Iron Dome and landed near the nuclear facility in Israel. And this scared a lot of people. And there was a great article on Strategic Culture about this. Now, quite honestly, I thought it was a bit hyperbole, him saying that, this will bolster the Palestinians. They will try. I mean, he was completely right. And so the attacks that commenced in the evening were really something else. I mean, like well over 350 strikes. An army munitions depot has exploded.
And I
Uh,
don't mean to brag, but I think a lot of what we've been saying about Israel for the past 2 years has been vindicated. Complete
yeah,
paper tiger. Their military is not nearly as impressive as you would expect it to be, especially with a country that gets that much money in military aid just from the United States, not even counting the other Western powers such as the UK, France, etc. And this is the best they can do. The Iron Dome, which is supposed to be the state-of-the-art, world-class air defense system, it gets outdone, frankly. Now, maybe I'm speaking a bit hyperbolically here, by Syrian S-200s and S-300s whenever they try to strike whenever Israeli forces tried to tried to strike Syria. It's like, come on, man. And again, I think it has a
yeah.
lot to do with operator error and whatnot. I don't think the Israelis are very well trained on how to use their equipment, which is a surprise, which makes you wonder how well American forces are trained to use their equipment. It does, again, questions upon questions upon questions with that sort of thing. But
Mhm.
what you get here is Israel's a paper tiger, as you were saying about 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, etc. That wayward anti-aircraft missile breached Israeli air defenses and landed near Dimona, which is one of their most important nuclear power plants. And
Right.
I have to agree with the consensus from you from Strategic Culture that this showed a weakness. This showed something that could be exploited, and the Palestinians, Hamas, waited for the right moment to exploit this, and oh boy, did they! And I do think it was a failed gamble by Netanyahu to try to exploit his power by provoking the Palestinians and giving a swift and clean response. Again, we've seen him do this several times before. But
It's a humiliation. I don't
oh
think that's hyperbole.
yeah,
I think Israel has been humiliated. No one expects the Palestinians to win, but far more importantly, no one expected the Palestinians to have created such huge consequences for Israel. No one expected this kind of retaliation.
and on top of all of that, the United States is quiet beyond Blinken putting out a press statement that, oh, we would just like to see an end to the violence and resuming of diplomacy. That was Blinken's statement. That was
Yeah, I saw that.
hardcore Zionist Jewish guy Anthony Blinken. That was his response to this, which shows, in my opinion, okay, number one, Biden hasn't said a thing. Kamala hasn't even said a thing about it. What we're looking at right now is Israel, again, the uh, boomer pro-Zionist conservative sort of right when they say we've turned our back on Israel. The Western world has turned its back on Israel because it's just not worth it, especially with the internal crises in the United States, which we'll get into the pipeline news about Israel and about the United States here in just a second. But at the end of the day, Nobody cares with the current state of America about Israelis and Palestinians continuing a feud that's been going on since 1948.
Hmm. Um, Funnily enough, the Israelis don't feel that different than the Palestinians now that no one is coming to their aid. Of course, America will to some degree, but yeah.
And all of this and the most recent reports is apparently Israel has not learned from 2006 and are moving tanks and armored units to the Gaza border. Which I can
Yeah,
only
yeah.
imagine what kind of, like, again, I say this like not in like a flippant manner, but like judging on how the 2006 skirmish with Hezbollah went, I wouldn't even call that a war. I'd call it a skirmish. I can only imagine how these tanks and this armor is going to do in Gaza. Again, trying this urban warfare setting with tanks. I'm no general. I'm no strategist. I'm no tactician, but it just seems really stupid.
I mean, what are Israel's options? To end this once and for all, they will have to make Israel like Syria. Ironic that that should happen.
True. No,
Um,
you. That is peak irony. Netanyahu having to employ the tactics of the butcher of Damascus, butcher Bashar, if you will, and whoo boy. Um,
I mean, it won't bother him, and no Western country will condemn him anyways.
oh,
But
of course not.
yeah.
Beyond the UN resolution, which the United States will just veto, yeah, 14-1 vote, which they did most recently. But again, what's a UN resolution? How many of those does Israel have against them? More than I can count. But
Mhm.
again, that's aside the point. That it's really just maybe and I'm not going to go this far. I'm actually not going to go this far. Some people would say we're in the last hours of Zionism, but damn if it hasn't showed that Zionism is more vulnerable than ever. That Israel is not just this guaranteed state in the Middle East. It's not just something that will exist against all odds. Has their propaganda machine has displayed them since their victory in the 1967 war. Israel is quite vulnerable. We've been saying this for a while, and it looks like those vulnerabilities have finally been exploited. Now, before we get into the esoteric side, do you just want to clean up some of the Middle Eastern news about Saudi Arabia and Syria and Iran?
Yeah, yeah. So today, delegates from Saudi Arabia have flown to Damascus, not the reverse, to court Assad, the lion, the Assyrian lion, and have asked for them to, a few years ago, there were several members of the Arab League who recognized Syria, the standout being Saudi Arabia. I think there might have been Qatar, United Arab Emirates that might have, might not have. Honestly, it's been a few years. I can't remember. However, I do recall Saudi Arabia not recognizing them. Well, Saudi Arabia has said that they would recognize Syria and its return to the Arab League. They've even offered possible, possible rebuilding funds. This is enormous. It's absolutely enormous because from the onset of the war, and this was one of the biggest mistakes Obama ever made, which was to topple Gaddafi and then to have the hubris to think he could do the same thing in Syria just because. It was an immensely stupid act because Syria is an incredibly important and strategic ally for both Russia and Iran. Russia and Iran already told him, this won't stand. You are not going to topple him. It won't happen. That was their red line. And we recall, based on the WikiLeaks from 2016, that besides Qatar, Saudi Arabia was funding ISIS, right? One of the reasons ISIS is so weak is some of that funding has dried up. it's still there. Who's who's doing it now? I don't know. Um, but it isn't what it was. And so it's an incredible move because this comes like about a week after Saudi Arabia acknowledges the Yemeni fighters, the Houthis in Yemen, calls them, brave uh, Arab fighters in the Arabian tradition. So it's heaping praise on them because its policy to wipe them out or its policy to wage war against them has failed. Uh, to that, we should talk about Biden because love him or hate him, Trump was pretty consistent on some things in the Middle East for most of the time, not all the time. Uh, he was apparently always on Israel's side, hated um, Iran, and supported Saudi Arabia. The only time I think where he seemed to have betrayed Israel is when Israel wanted him to engage, like in basically an all-out war, to take out Assad, and he just didn't listen to them. His attacks were fairly innocuous, with presenting very little mortal danger, very little infrastructure cost. I think only of the two attacks, I think only two or three people died combined.
Yeah,
And
compared to what was it, 20 casualties under Biden, which were conveniently enough all military casualties.
right, and what's fascinating is his reply. I remember at a news conference he was being questioned. Um, what are you going to do about Israel? And he just waves his hand in dismissal and says, Israel can take care of itself. Don't you worry about them. Not really what Netanyahu wanted to hear. Uh, so that was the only exception. What Biden has done is he's reversed course on a lot of policies in the Middle East, like the JPCOA. Um, Saudi Arabia hates that either way, but Saudi Arabia does not like Biden getting close with Iran. And I think this is one of the reasons why Saudi Arabia decided to go ahead of the curve and make friends with Syria and actually see if something profitable can come about. Because honestly, America's not in these talks, nor do they want America to be in these talks. So this is a big move. It's very, very pivotal. The last 3 days, I think they're going to resonate for decades. Um, so there could even be a rapprochement with Iran. If that happens, Israel will lose its mind, and frankly, so will America.
Well, are we talking about some real, what's it called, Samson option hours?
Yeah, they will completely lose their minds.
Oh, absolutely. There's no other response that they will give. It will be Israel's, uh, to put it in no better terms. I have no better terms to put it in. Israel's last stand, so to speak.
Putin wished Biden health. If this continues to develop, I will also wish Biden good health and be careful.
Man, this puts a whole new dynamic to it when you consider the president is 78 years old dealing with a situation like this. Probably one of the most pivotal geopolitical situations, I would say, since the fall of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, I mean it's slower than that, but yeah,
But
it's
yeah, like
starting.
I'm just talking about in terms of like
Yeah,
impact, like what the ramifications of all of this will be,
yeah.
and especially for him and his occultic ills. Which let's just get into the topic I've been begging to get
I
into.
think we should do maybe the pipelines before
Fair,
we
fair,
do
fair.
that.
Okay, you're breaking my heart. You're crushing my dreams, but I suppose you're right. So For some domestic news, Biden's wonderful energy policy continues with the colonial pipeline across the southeastern United States, Georgia, Alabama, up into North Carolina, has been allegedly attacked by hackers, which has caused major gas shortages on the east coast of the United States. And these look like pictures of the 70s where you have cars lining up to get gas. I do not live on the east coast, but I would go fill up my tank today because I don't know how far west the thing is going to spread. I figured better safe than sorry. What are you going to do? But with that being said, right there, it was again they blamed hackers, which apparently pipelines need to be connected to the internet for some reason. I don't know how that works, but I, for one, outright deny the hacker story. Whether it was Russian hackers, whether it was just some hooligans looking to raise hell, whether it was an inside job. I think what we're looking at here, honestly, is crumbling American infrastructure, which has been something of the past 20, past 30 years. The idea that we probably can't even build a proper pipeline anymore. It had some sort of difficulty, it had some sort of damage, and that shut down gas flow to the East Coast. I don't think it was hackers, no matter what they say, but I'm saying they probably had some other technical failure that they're trying to blame on the computers, as everyone does. Anyone who's ever worked with computers has blamed human errors, and it's just the system. What are you gonna do about it? You can't predict these things. What are you gonna do? Or, of course, in their case, it's like, well, these dastardly hackers shut down our energy source, coming from the guy who voluntarily destroyed 60,000 jobs and a pipeline on his first day in office. Yeah, I'm sure he's weeping over this. I'm sure Joe Biden's weeping over this. I'm sure the Democrats are weeping over this. The fact that this pipeline shut down, and that has driven up the national average gas price to $2.99. Nobody wants to cross that $3 average mark for obvious reasons, but they're willing to keep it at $2.99 average. And of course, that's for as large and as economically diverse a country as America. Your gas stations in Wyoming, of course, aren't going to be like what they are in New York or San Francisco. But point being is we're pushing that national average of $3 a gallon, and that's getting up to, I think the highest recorded was like national average was 375, and that was during the height of the Iraq War in 2008 and with the economic crisis just all around. But point being is, I think whether this was a hacking or whether it was just some infrastructure failure, we're really seeing the fragility of the American empire start to affect the average person. Not that a lot of these things haven't affected the average person, such as deindustrialization or economic policies, but gasoline for your car, and even when you consider fuel prices for heating homes. Now, I know we're in the spring moving into the summer, but maybe winter will be a different story. Fuel prices are really going to affect that, and I think it's undeniable that all of our infrastructure is crumbling, and our energy infrastructure is no exception. Despite how seemingly strong it was under Trump, the minute you got a president that was even slightly anti-American energy, we see these sort of things happen. Maybe I'm reading too much into this, but that's my take on it.
No, I think your take is a very good take because I think it allows room for several arguments congealing around one event. Um, Crumbling infrastructure, generally not having enough redundant systems to deal with this sort of thing. So basically, a lack of planning. Uh, it was also interesting, during the presser that Biden gave yesterday, he was semi-cautious about implying Russia. He didn't fully imply Russia, but just partially. One of the journalists asked him, you know, how are you going to, stop these sorts of attack that can come from, private individuals and state actors? And he said, well, we can and we will. We'll stop both. Um, and to that, he was asked about Russia, and he said, there's no indication that Russia was behind this. However, the ransomware seems to originate in Russia. So, we'll be keeping an eye on that. Something to words to that effect, like Russia isn't off the hook. Uh, now the Americans have used this ever since Obama's days. Anything goes wrong, it's Russia's fault. Brexit happens, Russia was to blame for it. German elections, you can find these articles where Merkel or Boris Johnson or Theresa May make the same kind of statements that American politicians do. Let's go out. What's her name from MSNBC?
Rachel
The Russians
Maddow.
are attacking. Yeah, Madhow. That's right.
Ugh.
We've been attacked by the Russians. So you know, it's a really interesting development because they're being held hostage right now. So how are they ever going to trace these guys? How are they going to find them? Who are they? And do they really have the goods? Do they really have all the data for this company that they're going to make public? It's extraordinary, honestly. I've heard people saying that this sort of thing would eventually happen, but it's really one of those things that's in the back of your mind. And you know, I don't know for sure. Is this a gay op? Is it the real thing? I can't absolutely say, but I think a lack of foresight, especially on the company's part, is there based on the the committee meetings that I saw today. Um, so it remains to be seen. We'll probably find out, and if we don't find out everything, we'll find out something. Though that doesn't mean we're not going to have to read between the lines. We'll see. It's still early.
Oh
Um,
yes.
anyways, this this, like you say, it's yet another example of this kind of ongoing slow decline. Uh, that's what it feels like. But there is, to return back to Israel, another pipeline that was affected, and that's the Ashkelon pipeline. A few weeks ago, we mentioned, well, about a month ago, we mentioned when that tanker was stuck in the Suez Canal, that there have been plans for Israel, and this goes back to the 70s in a joint project that they did with the Shah of Iran. So it's before the Islamic Revolution. To have the oil come through southern Israel at Eilat, or Aqaba, as the Arabs say, and transport that to the Mediterranean. Well, I mean, I would say even more than the direct hits in Tel Aviv and Lud and several Haifa and several other towns from these missiles. Uh, I would say the most significant hit happened on this pipeline, including one of the refineries, and it's a fire that they've been trying to put out for over 8 hours now. And now the oil that Israel is transporting to avoid, to basically take away some business from Egypt, is from United Arab Emirates. And as you know, United Arab Emirates has some troops uh, fighting on behalf of Saudi Arabia against the Houthis in Yemen. But this pipeline to deliver oil to the EU vis-a-vis Israel, this is an $800 million project. And right now, who knows? This is going to cost hundreds of millions. And furthermore, you know, it erodes trust. It's ironic to say that, for the sake of business, Egypt seems like a less chaotic place than Israel to do business.
Yes,
At
especially
least
after
the
recent
business of
events.
transporting oil.
Yeah, it's I never thought I'd see the day, but I guess here we are now. With all that being said, we're going to try to dedicate the second half of the show, give or take, to a bit more esoteric side, really honoring the name of this episode. So, just for some qualifiers for the takes we're about to give. So, I imagine most viewers of the show, if not all of you, realize at this point, both me, Constantine, and my good co-host GSP right here, we're good Orthodox Christian boys, and that's where our frame of mind comes from for this next segment. However, both of us being from the Anglosphere, me from the United States, him from Canada, and again, just to clarify, from my point of view at least, I wasn't raised particularly religious. I didn't really come from a religious background, but of course, culturally, and I think some people overplay it, the evangelicals are very influential, like in just the American public consciousness, and especially their ideas about eschatology, about the end times, the end of the world, and their views on Israel and the Middle East, going back to the Schofield Bible. Now, we'll get into the broader history of Christian Zionism in just a couple minutes here, but to give a brief summary right here, most American evangelical Christians believe, and most evangelical Christians in the English speaking world believe, that there's this dual covenant where Christians they're the ones who worship the true God, and they're the one, and you need to go to church, you need to do all that, but they also believe Jews, by virtue of being Jews, are also still God's chosen people, and that's where they come from with this, and they believe they're entitled to the land of Israel in the form of the modern state of Israel, and that they'll build the third temple, and the red heifer will show up, and that will bring upon the end times, the rapture, the second coming of Christ, etc. That's where the evangelical theology about the end of the world comes from. Now, of course, I reject that. You reject that. I imagine most of you probably reject that, if not all of you, especially if you're watching a program like this or listening to a program like this. But that's still the mindset of millions upon millions of Americans and millions upon millions of people in the English speaking world, and increasingly in the non English speaking world as American and Anglosphere missionaries do their works in places like Latin America and Africa and even the Middle East and Asia at this point. But with all that being said, this idea of Christian Zionism, of course, goes all the way back. It goes all the way back to the Puritan movement, which I think is a pretty ironic tie-in to all of this, and Oliver Cromwell and all of that. The idea that the Jews must return to the Holy Land in order for X, Y, and Z to take place. But I will say one thing for certain before I hand it over to you, because I know you have quite a bit to say on this. I do honestly believe that the most recent events in Israel, in a way, is the punishment for them saying they want to build the third temple. Now, they were saying this back in 2018, 2019. There was the plans for that, of course. We're going to construct the third temple, even though, again, in my opinion, the third temple means nothing, because why would a Jewish house of worship have anything to do, like, again, they clearly have broken with God for the past 2 millennia, so it doesn't matter. But again, you ask a lot of evangelicals, you ask a lot of Protestants, or just people who are vaguely Christian in general in the Western world, in the English-speaking world, they'll buy into that, they'll get into that, and like you said, you have a bit more deeper stuff on this, so I'll hand the reins over to you on it.
Right. So this goes way, way back. And so, up until very recently, it was not the position of Catholics or Orthodox or even mainline Protestants to advocate the idea that there were two simultaneous covenants, and the Jews had to go back to Israel because once the temple was rebuilt, the Antichrist, who would be a Jew, would make himself known. And this has some roots, ironically enough, in Ireland, from the Church of Ireland, from James Ussher's. He calculated the day of creation. But there was another Irishman, the name escapes me right now, and a former nun who came up with the idea of what we call dispensationalism now. And the Scofield Bible, its root argument for eschatology is based on that, which was developed in the first half of the 19th of the 1800s. So the argument is that for Christ's return to happen, the temple has to be rebuilt because that was the house of God, right? Which is actually against particularly Catholic and Orthodox teachings. So we believe that we are God's people, and it is only our temples who can be infiltrated where the Antichrist can come in. It cannot be in something that has already been won over by him. So now you can see how basically because it happens with Protestants essentially, but not even with mainline Protestants. We're talking about non-denominationals and evangelicals, right? And you can see how this this theory, although it has roots, and as we said, it goes back to Cromwell. Cromwell literally believed this. So it is older, but it was never taught as church eschatology. Again, not even Anglicans formally taught this. But Cromwell literally believed this, and this is why after Longshanks, who expelled Jews out of England, he invited them back in because he was convinced he had to take care of them and find a way for them to return to the Holy Land in order to, let's say, speed up or fulfill God's prophecy.
I
Because
mean, if you think about it, Christian Zionists are the real accelerationists.
yes, they really are the real accelerationists. 400 years of accelerationism. So, um, of course, there's a problem with this, and you can see that it's particularly within the Protestant, um, within Protestant eschatology, and just basically Protestant thinking, right? In a way, they don't have a communion, they don't have the host, and in a way, gradually over time, they don't even believe that they're the church, or to put it more succinctly, they're God's people. So, in a sense, to create authenticity, right? Um, they had to extend and extrapolate from the notion that Jews would still be in God's unfolding eschatology, but that what happened over time was they were given prominence. And so what you have with the Americans is like, well, I'm going to be airlifted by Jesus, and I don't have to worry about this place, which is enormously interesting considering how this kind of defeatist attitude, or this kind of escapism, is kind of rampant in many different forms, not just the religious form, all throughout the West,
Oh
whether
yeah,
someone is
especially,
secular or not.
and I do think it also has an interesting tie into politics, especially with how much evangelicals make up at least the base of the conservative movement. The idea that we
Yeah.
don't have to worry about anything, we don't have to put in any of our own work and effort because it's all going to be set right in the end. And again, like coming from two Christians, I look, we genuinely do
Yeah.
believe it will be set right in the end, but like, there's several steps you have to go through before you get to that point. You don't just get to go from point A to point B. But with that being said, it bleeds over into, of course, culture, pop culture, politics. The idea that, like, oh, we just gotta sit on our asses until until somebody else bails us out, or until God works His plan, and we have no part of it. We're just mindless automatons who exist for no reason, and that's at least what I read into it when they describe their theology, their eschatology. The idea that's like, oh, we just kind of exist. We have no role. We just kind of have to go to church. And again, it just doesn't add up for me. It just doesn't make sense to me. But and of course this ties in. It's one of the few areas where evangelicals are allowed to win because on all the social issues, on all the cultural issues,
Right.
gay marriage, abortion, creationism in schools, they get steamrolled time and time again. The entire past 50 years is about uh, Christians losing the culture war. But the one area where they get to win in politics, the evangelicals in particular, is that the American government is a steadfast ally of Israel and we're supporters of quote unquote God's chosen people. And it really makes you wonder why that's the one area they get the win. And I think we all know the answer to that. But it does play so much into this. And honestly, I've wanted to bring in some of the more esoteric and theological sides, even though I'm no scholar by any means. My knowledge is actually pretty shallow about these topics. I imagine yours is slightly deeper, but again, neither of us.
Yeah.
I doubt neither of us are, masters in divinity or whatever they call it. But point being is just delving into this kind of stuff. Because again, at the end of the day, these issues are all interconnected: politics, geopolitics, culture, religion, etc. And I do think what we're seeing here, as you said, probably the most important square mile in the world comes down to that dome with a rock now, doesn't it? And really, it's strange, especially in the Anglosphere, being in such a minority position. With me and you, and I imagine a lot of you, and even to our Catholics in the audience, I know it's not like they're an insignificant force in the Anglosphere. They're like 1/5 the American population claims to be Catholic. I imagine numbers are similar in the UK, Canada, etc. But point being is, like, even your most mainstream Catholics, like, they might not buy into the exact, like, just like rapture theory and Christian Zionism, but I doubt they're on the level where they believe in the same sort of eschatology that both churches have taught for the past 2,000 years, really. And
Yeah.
you look at Catholic theology today, even with a lot of the complaints some people have the current Pope. Catholic teachings on this stuff hasn't really changed. Sure, they don't really talk about them anymore. Sure, they try to keep it. Well, I wouldn't even say they tried to keep it quiet, but sure, they just kind of like don't address it. But it still exists. They haven't addressed it, even with the way a lot of people complain about the Second Vatican Council, which again I'm no scholar in Catholic history, so my knowledge is very limited on that. But to my understanding, again, like it's not like they redress those beliefs in the Second Vatican Council. But point being is, like this view when you put it together, like there's what 1 billion Catholics in the world, some like 500,000 Orthodox Christians. Again, that's the number of people who affiliate themselves with none. And again, that could vary from I go to church literally every opportunity I get to I go once or twice a year, and so it is casting a large net. But point being is you're taking the eschatology of pretty much two of the two largest Christian churches, and that gets completely pushed aside when it comes to this very fringe thing that I would say is even not popular among American evangelicals. And I'm not saying it's fringe among them. There's quite a few of them that believe it, and there's a reason they vote that they do and they believe the way they do, especially when it comes to the Republicans promising to support Israel. But it really does all click together when you start to piece things. And really, I am curious, and I think we've talked about this before, at least off air, if not on air. If Israel suffers a major blow, or dare I say it, is even ceases to exist as a state, what happens to these people? What happens to their prophecies? What happens to their religious beliefs? Do they retcon it and say, oh, that's not actually what we meant? We meant this, this, and this will happen? Do a lot of them fall away? And I'm really curious because it's one of those things that, like, it's one of those very, like, immediate things. Now, maybe not immediate in a human lifetime, but immediate in the lifetime of, like, you're going to know in a century or two how this sort of thing plays out. I mean, again, Israel has only existed for 73 years at this point. So, yeah, it's like, I don't understand, like, where they're going to take this if or when Israel fails to live up to their expectations. And that will be another big one because you've noticed, especially in recent years, that they've tried to justify American support for Israel in a lot of other ways too. For example, the only democracy in the Middle East. They have women's rights and LGBTQ CIA rights. They're an invaluable ally against terrorism and the jihadist movement, all of those things, etc. So you can tell that I think they're trying to start to move away from that, especially as a lot of the older people who believe in that are dying off, and their beliefs aren't really passed down to their children or grandchildren. And when you look at the retention rates of these things, so I think it may be a bit odd. We may be a little bit in over our heads, but this is still something that definitely needs to be addressed when it comes to Christian Zionism and what these people believe about the nature of the universe, about the nature of the end of the world, and how much. Again, I don't even want to say they influence foreign policy because even without them, it would go beyond that. Just because the power of the Jewish lobby in several countries, but how they garner the not maybe not even popular support, but a significant block of support for these kind of things in Western countries, particularly in the English-speaking world, particularly in the United States.
Right. I mean, I would say that they're falling out of favor. To be honest, they were far more popular in the '90s and the 2000s, particularly when Bush started the war with Iraq. But they go even further back when Bush Senior and Clinton were bombing Iraq. Um, I would say that's when they began having a lot of prominence. The teachings go basically back to John Nelson Darby, who's basically considered the father of dispensationalism. He was born in 1800, died in 1882. And then he influenced, this is who I meant, the Plymouth Brethren of the 1830s in Ireland and England. And this kind of radical form of dispensationalism eventually came here and it eventually influenced Schofield, right? So the
Yeah, of
idea
course,
is
Schofield
that,
had his money backers. I guess I bet you can never guess who those
yes,
people are.
Rockefeller, isn't it? I thought
Yeah, that
Rockefeller
one
was
of
one of them.
many, one of many. He was that, and then
Yeah,
in the 20s and 30s when they would used to have school children or children around school age go out and hand out free Bibles, they were the ones that were written with the Schofield commentary in them and had the footnotes about like this verse means this and this verse means that and
yeah,
here's why our
yeah.
eschatology and theology is right. And those are the Bibles that were widely distributed around American households from the 20s to the 40s. Very interesting time frame when it comes to Zionism and the establishment of the Israeli state. It makes you wonder if quite a few things, but it again, like these issues are inescapable when it comes to this. And as you said, they've lost a lot of their power, especially as Christians, particularly evangelical Christians in the United States, lost their culture war, especially after the second term of Bush ended, and their ideas fell out of favor when they really put their foot in their mouth on a lot of issues that they may have had popular support on. Like, for example, a lot of these social issues. You think gay marriage might be the big one where they really, I mean, it's a hard argument to botch. I know you're up against big money and interest, but still, it's a kind of hard
Yeah.
argument.
Well, I mean, their eschatology, their theology basically says that the only way God's word can be fulfilled is if like they literally are removed, right? So they see two dispensations working simultaneously, two programs working at the same time, and there's an appropriate time where they'll be like, you know, gone, and then what they see are unfulfilled prophecies for Israel that can happen. And so, in other words, what they actually believe is, if you believe, like, you would have to believe that the use of the temple um, prior to Christ was an appropriate dispensation, when in fact the destruction of the temple in 70 A.D. was like literally one of the reasons why so many people converted to Christianity, right? Because the message from Matthew 24, but it's in some of the other gospels as well, is tell us when the day of the Lord will come, and Christ points to they're on the Mount of Olives, and he points to the temple, and he says, "I assure you, not one stone will stand upon another." And that was a sign that when that would happen, then you knew um, that to some extent a part of Christ's return or a part of the will of God in prophecy had been fulfilled. And this is church doctrine for well over 1,000 years. And even when the church split between Catholic and Orthodox, both maintained this teaching. Um, so you could say that, like, in you know, the fracturing in the Protestant church into ever more and more fractions um, dispelled the idea of being a church that had a destiny.
And that's where America is the real interesting role in all of this, because Protestantism in the early days, and again the foundational days, you think Martin Luther, all of that, that started in German principalities, or with the Anglican Church in England, or the Calvinists in Switzerland. All places where these Protestant churches became more or less the state religion, if not outright. And then you have America, especially post implementation of the Constitution, because before that, you had a lot of these colonies and a lot of the states under the Articles of Confederation have some loose doctrine of what an official state church is. But after the U.S. Constitution said freedom of religion, let's not have an established state religion, America became the breeding ground for all sorts of theories and heresies. There's a reason why Mormonism started in America. Let's just put it that way. And of course, that grows out.
Or the Church of Satan.
Oh, yeah, for that matter. Speaking of which, Anton LaVey is, to tie this back in, was an ardent Zionist. He actually ran guns for them. And he was also Jewish. So, all these things sort of come together. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? But with all that being said,
Well, I mean,
no, go.
it also runs parallel to the Industrial Revolution, right? And to the need for oil. And because of course we all know that, like, Europeans had set up states, what we call today crusader states, that even for 100 years controlled Jerusalem, then lost it. But as oil became more and more important, I do think there was a confluence of both Zionist interests and Anglo, and then later Anglo-American interests, particularly for oil, because at that time I think Russia was the biggest oil producer in the world, oil and grain. And so when oil was being discovered in the Middle East, everybody knew that in the West, particularly Britain and America, that having oil in the Industrial Revolution became really important. And you can kind of piece together right away, like your instinct guides you, your intuition guides you where this is going to go. So you make a you popularize a Bible that basically, tells the church you have a very kind of specific destiny, but you don't have this huge overarching destiny with even a tragedy in it, because it is a tragedy, right? So for the Antichrist to reveal himself in God's temple, it has to be God's temple. It can't be a dispensation that's already gone, which was already deemed, no longer effective, uh, and no longer could reach God. So you can see how this development, the way it was nurtured, because I think for a lot of libs and for a lot of leftists, they've always wondered why, whether it was a Democrat or a Republican, but particularly with Republicans. But you could argue that Democrats were too soft on um, on uh, on evangelicals, right? Well, I mean, they're literally the biggest supporter of Israel. Uh, they give them enormous amounts of money. They they build consensus for
Yeah, they're a
Israelis.
propaganda machine for them among particularly
Yes,
evangelical Christians, but other, like, again, people who are vaguely Christians. Maybe they don't go to church often, if at all, but consider themselves Christian. But the Christian culture they've been entrenched in, especially when you get into some of these Bible Belt parts of the country, is, well, of course Christians support Israel. You got to look at the Old Testament. Jews were God's chosen people, and not reading any further into it or looking at what the church, even most Protestant churches, believed up until a century prior at that point.
that's right. They make you believe that the 18th centuries prior to 1835 or thereabouts taught exactly the same thing that the Scofield Bible does, or pastors that use the Scofield Bible. So you can see how important this movement has been for geopolitics, right? they're indispensable. I mean, they were indispensable. I think they've run their course. I think they are dispensable now because I think the latest incarnation of America has developed. I would say that the height of dispensational evangelicals was probably the 90s, even if you saw the biggest hurrah was like in the 2000s. I would say that also they were pretty significant in the 80s. And the reason I say that is because, of course, Gog Magog, Russia is Magog, the evil Soviet Empire. It's going to come down and fight against Israel. So they really believe this. Like that's their interpretation of Christian eschatology. And um, but the latest incarnation of America just doesn't support any of that. It's extremely liberal. It's extremely materialistic. It's extremely hedonistic. Um, it's actually closer to the fundamental ideas in the Constitution in many ways about individual freedom. And I mean, when Blinken meets anybody, any country, any diplomat that is of a country that is an adversary to the U.S., he's not going to bring this up. He's going to bring up gay rights or human rights, and so on and so on. So um, they have a much more diminished role, but there is still a role. And of course, there's groups of evangelical Christians that have even attempted to blow up the Temple Mount to force the Al-Aqsa to basically cave in on itself.
Yeah, and the
Uh,
funniest thing out of all of this, you look at the opinion polls about how religious groups view other religious groups. American Jews have nothing but contempt for evangelical
yes,
Christians. Like they're like among the lowest. They're lower than Muslims. They're lower than other Christian groups. Even again, like that. Like you listen to what a lot of they say Spanish Inquisition, Catholicism is so terrible to us. The pogroms in Russia, etc. They still, saying all that, view the American evangelical Christians as the lowest of the low when it comes to other religious groups.
mhm. Yeah. So they have literally no respect. Um, um, but yeah, so you can see. I'm sure like there's probably certain YouTubers and blog writers that are right now going to really heighten the talk about the destruction of the temple and what it means, and so we'll see a lot about that. But I think it's very interesting how the evolution of this eschatology developed with the Industrial Revolution and the importance of oil and the need to be permanently in the Middle East in order to control that supply, right? For basically, for geopolitical hegemony. So, and now it's on the wane, right? But the last 2 days have seen the greatest amount of turmoil that we've seen in decades in Jerusalem and in Israel and Palestine.
Oh, absolutely. And what you have with all of this is my take right here is going to be I do not believe we are in the end times, but I do believe that even from, again, a broader esoteric theological standpoint, however you want to use these words, but okay, maybe metaphysical would be the best umbrella term for all of this. Things that are really outside of the scope of the human mind. That these events, and particularly such an important place in the world, even if you aren't Christian, even if you aren't Jewish, even if you aren't Muslim, even if you're not religious at all, you gotta admit how like these places hold a great amount of importance, even just the human mind, which of course I don't believe, but I'm sure plenty of people would hold that position. This is a monumental moment when it comes to the bold prediction I said the other day is the rapid downfall, if not collapse, of the American empire, with Israel being shown to be a weak player on the world stage, with Israel being shown to be a paper tiger, and the Americans not really putting out a response against so far. The most response we have from any American official is Blinken saying, well, we need peace talks to resume, and of course he's going to be more on the pro-Israel side. Most American officials who came out have said we need to stand with Israel in this crucial time. But point being is, there's no solid word from the White House, no word from Joe Biden or Kamala Harris or any of these people, or like I said, the U.S. State Department. The most they had was Blinken's statement out there. But I do believe, regardless of how you feel about that, this is a point in which the American empire has lost a lot of legitimacy and will continue to. And this is going to be not only a blemish on Israel's reputation in particular, but the broader global liberal order that's aligned with Israel.
Right. I think Israel has been humiliated. Uh, it's a colossal failure. People will be asking about how the American Patriot missiles could have performed so poorly, and on and on. Or maybe the strategies employed by the Palestinians, by Hamas, were just that much superior. They literally sent so many, the Israelis began running out of missiles. And as you say, in some cases, they were hitting their own missiles. But if you want to take a look at like what the future justification for the protection of Israel will be, I give you this tweet by Blake Flayton, Tel Aviv, the queer, feminist, egalitarian capital
Oh
of
boy,
the
I
Middle
saw this.
East. Yes, Hamas is firing rockets at it because it's filled with Jews, but also because it stands as a beacon for human freedom. Jihad will never win against these impenetrable values. And that, I mean, if if you've ever read anything that was a nutshell of American foreign policy since the second term of Obama, this is it.
Continuing on the
Uh,
theme, I just want to add an addendum to that. Pretty sure where Tel Aviv is today is where they believe Sodom and Gomorrah to be.
yeah, yeah, but there you have it, human freedom, right? So that is going, that is where they're going to build, and you can understand why. There were so many invested European, Anglo, and Jewish partners that wanted to see China liberalize, right? Because, of course, if you do, then you have these modern identities that you can rally at your beck and call. You don't need to just, have the Uyghurs believe that you're going to save them, because the Uyghurs are frankly far more problematic for American hegemony than gays or trans people. Far more. They've literally never had a minority that can mushroom in any country better than these identities. And so that will be the reason, why Israel has to be defended. Not Israel in and of itself, not Israel, uh, they'll overlook like, marriage between Muslims and Jews is forbidden, or Jews with anyone else is forbidden. But um, all of that will be ignored because they have gay pride parades, right? So yeah, so that's where it's going, and you can see why they're so frustrated when they can't liberalize other countries, because it creates problems for them, right? They expect these identities, these infiltrators to mushroom in every country. This gives them like carte blanche, right? They can exert their power, almost immediately, um, and get their sympathies, just like with the George Floyd riots, right? Like none of those leftists protested to even anything remotely like George Floyd, with the, let's say, with Ramallah, or uh, you know, I mean, in my day, there were more of those protests, but they're a thing of the past. They're basically like 20 years old now. It's almost a quarter of a century. And of course, they were much more quiet during Clinton's day. Not extinct, but quiet, quieter than usual.
Oh, absolutely. And this entire situation, again, I do truly believe that even just you want to get as basic as geopolitically speaking, we are in the end of an era. I think what we've seen is irreparable damage to the reputation of the state of Israel and the security apparatus of the state of Israel, for that matter, as well as the American empire as a whole. Maybe you'll get a reevaluation of the role of Israel in the American empire, cause rift there. I mean, you've already had those people, again, Brzezinski was one of them, Brzezinski influenced Obama, etc., where Israel should be put on the back burner in the interests of other key imperial assets. You may think the Iran deal,
Right,
you may think other things like
because
that.
Israel can't. Israel doesn't have the. Israel can incorporate like woke global homo identity, but it's not really about that. America can become that completely, fully. Like they can embody that more completely and make that a crusade, a kind of perverse messianic mission, more than any other country in the world. Its truest believers are in America. They would be willing to have, they would be willing to commit violence in order to, you know, achieve their goals. I mean, even take a look at Assad. Assad was portrayed as a, as a Nazi, and the Palestinians will be portrayed as Nazis. You're going to see photos of Arabs and Palestinians that joined Hitler's forces. I would think that was going to get more mainstream now in order to shame them,
Yeah, you'll
right?
also
That's
see
another.
the Roman salute is still very popular among various groups in the Middle East. You have Syrian rebels doing it. You have Syrian forces doing it. Hezbollah loves to do it. Just the 45-degree angle, right arm up, which, again, judging by the name, literally goes back to trying to imitate the salutes that the Roman soldiers did. But
Yeah.
yeah, so you're gonna see that all over the place. You're gonna see this two-pronged attack where they'll really play up to the right wing. We have to stop the jihadists. Israel's our first line of defense against the jihadists, like they did after 9/11, and of course they'll play up to the left wing, saying, "Well, these people, they're like neo Nazis. Look, they admire Hitler. We got to stand with the Israelis because they're the real anti-fascists out here, carrying on the work of the brave soldiers who fought at Normandy, who believed in gay and trans rights." That'll be the left wing narrative, and again, the right wing narrative will be we have to defend liberal civilization from those illiberal Muslims. And it'll be worse than the post 9/11 era in terms of narrative because they won't even give you the idea that you're a Christian civilization, that you're Western civilization. It's going to be defending liberal civilization. They're not going to use those words, but it's going to be about defending abstract things like freedom and democracy, and not, like, again, your beliefs or your homeland. And we've seen them employ this rhetoric before, but I can only expect it's going to go into overdrive over these next few weeks.
Right. And I guess we should say that there has been an attempt at a blending of both the evangelical dispensationalist approach to garner support and protection for Israel and, the woke ideologies. And that's kind of embodied with, you know, figures like Lady Maga, you know, who is as American as apple pie, and she doesn't know that much about the conflict between them. But in her words, if I tried that in Palestinian territory, you know, I could get hurt really bad, but I wouldn't in Israel. So, and you kind of see this, the stupid normie conservatives, um, who support Trump, or even some of the evangelicals that thought like Trump really was Cyrus. Like, not okay, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but they thought that God did really put him there. Um, I mean, he did, but no more than anybody else. And So you do see this kind of blending. They would really like the evangelicals not to be so uptight. After all, you both love Israel, don't you? And you kind of see this attempt prior to Trump getting elected and during Trump's time. This a tremendous force, what was coined as the alt-right uh, of conservatives, um, classical liberals,
Civic nationalists, all those sort of people.
yeah, and Christian conservatives. That all of you can exist on this under this tent, this broad, expansive tent, and and why wouldn't you? Because freedoms is what makes the West so great, and so on and so on.
Yeah, freedom, what that freedom entails, it's anyone's guess. Uh, sure, we might be a free society, but we're going to ban you from every social media site, ban you from all these financial platforms. But it's all about freedom because at least we're not living under Nazism, communism, or Muslims. And you can't
Right,
you
right,
can't you can't live
exactly
your
it.
you can't live the life that your grandparents lived in a relatively Christian society where you were left mostly unmolested by the government. But you know what? At least we defeated those jihadist communist Nazis.
Yeah, yeah. Don't worry, you're going to go up in the rapture anyways. What about my kids? Well, they might get raptured too. So,
And
uh,
again, that's getting back into the evangelical and
yeah,
apostasy rates where I think it's something like 60-70% of their children and grandchildren have either left for a different religious belief, if no religious belief at all. Yeah,
yeah,
they have some of the worst retention. That's compared to the other ones I know off the top of my head are Catholicism with like 59 or 60% retention rate, where most of them will, again, a slim majority of them will still identify with Catholicism, maybe not be devout Catholics into their adult lives. And again, just all these other like mainline Protestants, they're lower. I think they're just a slight minority will quote unquote retain their faith. But yeah, evangelicals, Mormons, they're up there for some of the worst apostasy rates. And funny enough, they're actually some of the big supporters of Israel, of Zionism. And it goes back, they love to quote, I believe it's Genesis 12, where they say, God will bless those who blesses Israel when they
yeah,
have
yeah,
poured
yeah.
out their hearts and souls for Israel, and believing that means something in a material sense, whereas they lose every culture war battle, whereas America just continues to go downhill since 1948. In fact, it was actually one of those, I can't remember his name, but he was this Protestant preacher that was actually anti-Zionist, saying like, do you really believe that we're supposed to be supporting Israel and that God blesses those who bless Israel if this is what's been happening to you since the 1940s? Again, I can't remember his name, but it was very strange to see from a Protestant preacher. But he made some good points
Mm.
insofar as that goes. And again, you could also tie that in. I don't want the show to run for an hour and a half again or 2.5 hours
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
about prosperity gospel, the idea that like the fruits of Christian labor will manifest on earth rather than in the next world, etc. And again, just sort of that uh, breeding ground and combination of all these different offshoots of Christianity and all these different what you and I would consider heresies of Christianity, things that have cropped up over the past 1,500 years and have been repeatedly suppressed and have been able to fester in the petri dish of religion that is the American continent. And I will leave you guys with one last esoteric take on all of this. I believe the current state of the American continent is the fact that most Americans, in some way, shape, or form, have apostatized, don't really believe in God, despite what they might claim, and that we have abandoned God's protection and are being tormented by the demons that claim to be the deities of the Native Americans, and they're trying to enact revenge on us for slaughtering all their followers. That's my unironic take on the state of America right now.
Well, I would have to agree, and that's another reason why we'll have to ride the tiger, and even Israel is riding the tiger right now.
Oh, of course, of course. Who would have thought all these things coming together in a? I don't know how you'd really describe this, but in an interesting way, no less. And of course, we'll be here to document it. Let us know if you guys like the more esoteric takes on this sort of thing, because I try to incorporate them here and there. Again, like I said, I'm no expert on these sort of things. I'm definitely much more well versed in the politics and civilizational side over the theological and religious side, but I'll try to spice my commentary up with these takes if you guys enjoy them, and learn more about it as time goes on, because I think it does provide a valuable insight.
Yeah, I think it does.
But with that being said, thank you for tuning into this very interesting and special episode of the War Report. And to think we just did an episode on Saturday, the news is moving that fast at this point.
I,
And we will see you guys. Who knows? Could be tomorrow, could be whenever. But I suppose we'll just have to see how rapidly this news cycle moves before we see you guys next time. But probably, I don't know, Saturday at the latest. But with that being said, thank you all for tuning in to this episode of the War Report, and goodbye.
Take care.